This video will explain what main clauses and subordinate clauses are and how to identify them in a sentence. First of all, just to clarify what a clause is. A clause is a building block in a sentence. It is a part of a sentence, and so we put clauses together to make sentences. A main clause. Every sentence needs a main clause. A sentence can have more than one main clause. A main clause can stand on its own as a sentence. Here's an example of a sentence that has a main clause. I live in a big house. We have one verb in this phrase, and this clause can stand on its own as a complete sentence. Nothing needs to be added for this to make sense, and so this stands on its own as a main clause. Here is another example. I live in a big house and I own a car. Now, in this instance, we still have the one verb in the phrase I live in a big house that forms a main clause, and that could stand on its own as a full sentence. However, the sentence hasn't finished there, because we also have another phrase with a verb in it that could also stand on its own as a sentence. And so we have two main clauses. Main clause 1, I live in a big house. Main clause 2, I own a car. To join those two clauses, we have used the coordinating conjunction and that has joined two separate main clauses and given us a compound sentence. Subordinate clauses. They provide additional information to support the main clause. A sentence can have more than one subordinate clause. A subordinate clause cannot stand on its own as a sentence. Here is an example. I live in a big house which is located just outside Winchester. And so we have the main clause, I live in a big house, and we have now added the subordinate clause, which is located just outside Winchester. This phrase provides information on where the big house is, so it expands on the main clause, but it cannot stand on its own as a sentence. A sentence that simply read, which is located just outside Winchester, would not make sense and is therefore not a main clause. This is a subordinate clause that adds additional information to the main clause. Here is another example, a sentence with two subordinate clauses. Although my family is actually quite small, I live in a big house, which is located just outside Winchester. So we have the same subordinate clause as before, which is located just outside Winchester. Can't stand on its own as a sentence, but it provides information as to where this big house is. And now we also have another phrase that provides information to expand on the main clause, to do with the size of the family in comparison to the size of the house. It cannot stand on its own as a sentence. It would not work just have a sentence that said, although my family is actually quite small. That is a subordinate clause that is providing additional information to the main clause that remains, I live in a big house. So, spotting subordinate clauses in sentences that other people have written. Two key questions to ask. Could this part of the sentence stand on its own as a complete sentence? So if I take away all the other words and just read that part of the sentence, does it make sense on its own? And does this part of the sentence begin with a conjunction? This is another big clue. You saw in the examples that earlier we had which and we had although, a conjunction, a joining word to show that we're joining an idea to the main clause. So to recap, main clauses. Every sentence needs a main clause. A sentence can have more than one main clause, and a main clause can stand on its own as a sentence. Subordinate clauses. They provide additional information to support the main clause. A sentence can have more than one subordinate clause. A subordinate clause cannot stand on its own as a sentence.